Um, and I'm going to first start. Oh, Janine already recorded. Good job, Janine. So I just wanted to invite everybody. Several of you have been here before, but just to let you in on what IL MathCom is we're really trying to highlight the work that teachers across Illinois are doing and resources that are freely available across the country and even the globe. And really our goal, both my goal and Janine's goal, have been to really share and spread the joy and wonder of mathematics. So I love math, and so this is what our goal has been all along. We did have a conversation last spring with Dr. Barry, who's the current president of NCTM, and he talked to us about his research on Black boys do math. And we found that we ran out of time. We had a lot of people there and we ran out of time, and people said they'd like to kind of continue that conversation. So that's why we had that. So I'm going to do a couple introductions. First of all, I am Heather Brown. I work with the State Board of Education through ISU. I am a math content specialist. And then Janine.
Hi, I'm Janine Shepard, same position for math and science, and I'm in Southern Illinois.
And Janine did a presentation today, and she was able to get one of her people to stick around and join our call as well. Kevin McClure is also a content specialist with Illinois, except Learning Supports. Do you want to say hi, Kevin? He's waving. Everybody's on mute right now. And then Eli Luberoff will be our guest from Desmos. I'm going to let you introduce yourself when we're done with a few housekeeping things. So if you have not already turned on your camera, we really appreciate it if you do. We find it really helps with conversation, especially I think even more so when we're talking about some kind of hot button topics that we may get into today. We will definitely encourage you to talk, and there will be time where you kind of will be talking a little more back and forth. But if you are not currently speaking, especially as Eli and Kevin, where did my screen just go? Sorry. As Eli and Kevin are kind of talking about some of the resources and ideas that they're sharing, if you could keep yourself on mute, that would be great. A couple other things. I think I already said where the video is in the bottom left. Our disclaimer that we always have is any resources or curriculum or anything that is shared by people is not necessarily endorsed by ICTM or ISU. So I will post more than once in the chat window a couple different things for you. The first one that I will post is our forum. And the reason I post this is you can certainly share any topics that you want in the chat window, but the chat window does disappear. Unfortunately, with the recording, the chat window doesn't stick with it. I recently found out there are some softwares that do that, so maybe we'll look into that in the future. And I will, but most of the things that we do in the chat window will be captured and saved on the forum, which anybody can watch it or read at any time. But if you'd like to just share directly there, please do so. As people are talking, I do try to keep track of any websites or anything that people say and put them over there. If you didn't hear about us from our listserv, please consider joining our listserv or following us via Twitter or Facebook, which I will put those links in as well. And lastly, oh, I just sent that to just Dana, apparently. Sorry, Dana. Oh my God.
Heather, now you're muted. But I appreciate that Captain didn't approve of you just sending it to me.
Sorry, I was aware I was muted. My dog just went nuts over something that happened outside, so I apologize. That was kind of humorous. But I did post all of the things I just talked about there, as well as the post survey. And unfortunately for everyone that watches the recording, that will be part of it because we don't have the ability to splice. So, okay, sorry, bringing it back down. You guys only heard it for a second, but he kept barking at a very, very loud rate for a little longer. But I will go ahead, and today we are talking, our topic is equity and access in mathematics. I have a few resources that I would love to share with people. but I will let our guests speak first. So to begin with, Eli, would you give us an introduction of kind of who you are and where you've been, and then kind of tell us what you want to tell us?
Yeah, that would be my pleasure. So who here on the call, let's try just like show of hands, has ever used Desmos? Awesome, a few and not everyone. I love that. Let me get just a quick show of hands of maybe grade levels that folks teach. Are we looking at middle school? Are we looking at high school, elementary, college? What do you think the breakdown is going to be? Maybe I'll just ask Heather. Or
yeah, I think a lot of us are people, like I know we have a superintendent, we have a couple consultants, a couple high school and middle school. I think that's basically everybody that's currently on the call.
Awesome, I love it. So yeah, a little bit of background on Desmos for those who don't know. We are a small company out of San Francisco that I started about 6 years ago, spread out across the country. So I'm the founder and CEO at Desmos. And the thing that people know us best for, although it's not everything that we do anymore, is a graphing calculator, which might sound like a pretty small thing. But a big motivation for the graphing calculator was equity and access, inspired by some time that I spent when I was in college. So I paid my way through college mostly by tutoring extremely wealthy families in Westport, Connecticut, and volunteering with students in New Haven, Connecticut, who had nowhere near access to the same resources. And one of the things that struck me the hardest was the difference in access to handheld calculators and the need for every student to buy a handheld calculator. And the more that I learned about this, the more angry I got. I don't know if you guys are all on the same page, but these devices that should cost $5 or $10 instead costing $150 because of policy reasons, and having that be a real large source of inequity, both in end-of-year high-stakes assessment and even in day-to-day instruction. Really infuriating. We dug deeper. We found out that Texas Instruments makes $500 million a year selling these calculators, and that to us was bonkers. Us at this point is like 2 people. This was me on my couch. And so built a free version on Desmos.com and now in apps, just to see what we could do with it. And over the past 6 years, it's grown so that now Desmos is built into the SAT if you take the digital SAT. And it's built into the state test now in 24 states and growing. And it continues to be free for students and teachers. And so one of my major points of focus in my whole career and in everything we do here is equity and access, both for students with different kind of economics, and also a big focus and part of what I think Heather asked me to join today about was for students with disabilities, students with visual impairments, blind students, making sure that we're able to support everyone. So that's my just monologue background of me and Desmos, and I think why I'm here and why this kind of conversation is actually the most exciting kind of conversation I get to participate in. It's really inspiring to be able to kind of close some of these achievement gaps that drive frustration for me. So I want to pause, hand it back to Heather for a second, and also to anyone with questions on that introduction. There's a couple things that I could do from here. So one is that I put together just like a little bit of a presentation. It's a very truncated version of the one that I'm going to do at the California Math Council conference tomorrow. That goes over a little bit more of the background and philosophy and the ways that we think technology can help make a more equitable education world. I could also skip past that and just demo some super cool features of how Desmos can be used with blind students. Or I can do Q&A. This is totally up to you. Tell me how long you want me to go and what I can do that's the most useful.
I think you can go a full 20, 30 minutes if you want. So if you want to do, is that enough? If you want to do a short presentation and then do the demo, I'm sure that will lead to some questions and answers. So is that good with everyone else? Everyone give a nod if you're good with him doing a little bit of all of those things. Yeah, great. Go ahead.
I love it. So I'm actually going to start with a prompt that I want everyone to answer. I'm sorry, I'm going to put you all on the spot. So this is my favorite question to ask at the beginning when it's a group where it's manageable. And that is, what is the thing that you are most interested in learning about in the next 15 minutes? And let's just go through in order. Kevin, can we start with you?
Kevin, superintendent. Kevin McClure. One Kevin, you don't
you're
care.
on superintendent. You're on mute right now. I think you started talking. Kevin, superintendent. Kevin.
That's what I thought.
Not wrong, Kevin. That Kevin.
Okay. No, go ahead. Kevin McClure.
Oh no, there's two Kevins. I've made a huge mistake.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing about Desmos. And one of the things I think that I'm most interested in learning about, if you can get to this, is really how does Desmos help with professional learning for your educators, and how does it support their capacity process with math standards, and here in Illinois, it's the Illinois Learning Standards based upon Common Core, and how does your platform assist with professional learning?
Brilliant. Let's go next to Janine.
I want to hear more about how the way that your software makes math more accommodating for visually impaired students.
Awesome. And your guest in frame.
I'm not that familiar with the program, so I would just like to learn more about it and how I can incorporate it into my 8th grade standards.
Love it. Kathy. Oh, Kathy looks out of frame. Heather, you get to answer this question too.
Yeah, I'd like to see it more. I'm curious to see either what you're currently doing or what you have on the block for other students as well, like students who have difficulty with writing or typing. Do you have a text-to-speech? Do you have a speech-to-text software? Different things like that you currently have besides just for the visually impaired.
Awesome. Other Kevin.
Obviously, pretty diverse district we have, so obviously our focus is a little bit more about that equity for students, and obviously how your software can certainly engage our students. Very interesting topic of kids having phobia with math, and working on a lot of growth mindset with our students and focusing on can do versus not yet. So anything we can open up opportunities for students. We have a large population of Latino parents, and so we have a bridge of language gap. So anything we can provide to our parents outside of school as well as home to kind of open opportunities is what we're looking for. So I'm the only superintendent, sorry, not the math content specialist here, so I will point to you guys for all of the answers.
Perfect. How do I say your name? Alfreda? Alfreda? Alfreda.
Alfreda, yes.
How about you?
I'm an instructional math coach, and I'd like to know how I can use it to support the teachers that I serve and help them integrate its use into their instruction.
Phenomenal. Jackie.
Mute, right? Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. First, thank you. I love the freeness and the whole story behind it. Keep it that way. Keep it strong. To the superintendent, thank you for being in on the call and representing the people that don't do math, but actually listening to us math people. I really appreciate that too. I'm a department chair in Naperville, and equity and access is a super big umbrella. So I'm interested in wherever this conversation goes. I have used Desmos with your friend Scott, and to do some equity work to help math students see justices and injustices in a non-threatening way, and how they can use math to understand this crazy world around them. But I'm more interested now, we're still working in that world, but under the same umbrella, I'm looking forward to seeing how we can use Desmos to help our struggling math students go from procedural to conceptual and jump that gap and try and make the connections that we can't make by explaining it over and over and over again by using some of the powers of Desmos.
I love it. Kathy.
I guess I'm most interested in just learning all that I can. I've actually got a couple of students who walked into my room, and they are so grooving on seeing you, Eli. They're so excited in the back to meet you because we use Desmos, and they're loving it. Oh my gosh, I sound like I'm gushing, but they are so excited to be here, and they just walked in and are just excited to see you. But I'm just trying to learn everything and more, because I think I don't know what I don't know, and there's so much that I don't know. So anything, I'm just kind of trying to absorb.
Brilliant. Put them in frame. We love students.
They're being shy now.
Well, tell them hi from me.
No, you see, no, she won't.
That's amazing.
Being shy is never shy.
Dana, how about you?
Don't expose me.
Okay. Actually, I'm much like Kathy. I feel like I don't know what I don't know yet. And I always love listening to you talk about it and share your passion. And I think you really articulate the how vital technology can be in the role of making equity for equity and access for everybody. And I always love to see what new stuff's out there. I mean, I feel like every time I hear or anything about Desmos, there's one new piece of something that I hadn't known yet. And so I'm looking forward to seeing what that new piece is. And pretty happy that you guys are able to be so successful with assessments and across the states already. So just glad to be here and listen.
Both. And do we have Julie? I don't see video, but I don't know if your audio is hooked up, Julie.
Julie, can you hear us? Can you unmute?
Let's assume that's a no. So that was actually a really, oh, Julie, yeah. What are you most excited to learn?
I can hear you guys. I just don't have video today. Definitely, I am along the lines with the superintendent there. Not that exciting of a role or that broad of a reach, but I'm really fortunate that my math department in my building, I'm an assistant principal, they're really dedicated and they work really hard, but they don't have enough tools and resources. And so I'm just trying to reach out and figure out what else we can provide to them, because they hit that wall of frustration sometimes because they know they're not able to reach all the kids. And so we're just trying to figure out what else we can make available to them. We're using Desmos, and they're planning to watch this information session after it goes in the archives. So thanks so much for the info.
Amazing. All right, that was actually extremely helpful. Because of the amount of ground that I think we want to cover, I'm not going to do my presentation. It's about why it is that I care so much about equity and access for reasons of justice and democracy, and why I think the math classroom is so important because of economic opportunity and because it's a universal language that can cross students. I don't think I need to convince anyone on this call that math is super important, that public education is super important, that supporting every student instead of just wealthy students is important. So I'm going to skip right past that and dive into a little bit of what Desmos does. And I'm going to put a little bit more emphasis than I was expecting on some of the pedagogy and also some of the resources that you can share back with other teachers who maybe want to learn more about Desmos themselves. Does this sound like the right way to spend the next 10 minutes or so?
Yeah, that sounds perfect.
Brilliant. In that case, I'm going to just pull up the Desmos.com calculator and share my screen. Is this showing up for folks? All right. So for those who have never seen this, all that you do is you go to Desmos and you click Start Graphing. You don't need to make an account. You don't need to sign up for anything. You definitely don't need to pay for anything. That's not just temporary. That's actually written into our terms. No matter what, as long as I'm in control here, Desmos is going to be software that is free for students and for teachers to use these kinds of tools. Here's the premise, is that we wanted to make something that was intuitive enough that every single student, not just the ones who are already math confident, could experience success and have stuff work for them. One of our values that we write up on our wall is works every time. And so a few ways that this is written in to everything that we do. We've got our on-screen keypad so that you don't even need to know how to format things. Most students end up figuring it out, but you type an equation and it just graphs it, and that's it. And our goal is to make it so that there's as few barriers between here's the math that I want to explore and here's the way to do it as possible. We don't want instructions that look like go to the second menu and then press tab and then do this and then do zoom fit. Like that's not what we want. We want it to just work. And so a few other things like that. You can open this up on your phone. It's a free app for iPhone and for Android. And if you're on a phone and you want to zoom in or zoom out, you just pinch it like if you're using Google Maps. And so that's just an interaction that students are familiar with. In here, if you want to trace, you just click and drag and you trace. And so the starting point that we wanted is this idea of a low floor and a high ceiling, where you come in, you try something, the software feels like it's cooperating. You're not like, oh, this isn't for me, this is for those other kids. That's the low floor. And the high ceiling is that we want to make it possible to grow with students as far as they want to explore. So let me give you one example of the type of exploration that a student could do on their own, but also a teacher could do with their entire class. So here we've got our y equals x, and we can start to talk about what happens as we change parameters. And this is all about moving from procedural to conceptual. So here, now I change it to x plus 2, and what happened? Well, it moved up by 2. Or some students might think it moved left by 2. This is an interesting conversation to have as well. What happens if I introduce a coefficient in front? It's going to change slope. And all of this is happening immediately. There's no extra stuff that has to happen. And so not only does that make it a little easier to use, but it ends up, there's such good research about when you can see the two representations side by side connected to each other, you're able to understand things in a way that you can't if you have this extra friction of switching between and trying to make sense of that. Any questions so far on what I've shown? What do you think?
Seen that much before. We're good.
Okay, we're going on. We're going on. So we're going on to more advanced. So we're going to, instead of having those be 3 and 4, we're going to start to talk about parameters, and we're going to think about families of functions. And so here, if I look at y equals mx plus b, the slope-intercept form, now instead of just typing a bunch of numbers, I can actually see what happens as I slide this. What does m do? And I can animate it.
So what I think is cool, Eli, is that you just did it without us seeing it, but you literally just typed in y equals mx plus b, and then it said to you, do you want sliders? Like that's how easy making sliders was, right?
Yeah, exactly. Our goal is to just work every time. If you type something we don't understand, we try to give you good guidance on how to make it into something that we understand. We want it to feel like the software is cooperating with you. And so this is an example where we put in a ton of work into making it so that you can go from here to here as quickly as possible. We also didn't want to like do that thinking for you. We didn't want to assume that M and B are sliders because maybe there's something different. And so we want kind of this combination of the computer being extremely helpful, but still having it be that you're the one in control in the driver's seat. One of the things that we measure really carefully to evaluate our success of working for every student is we look at a metric called bounce rate, which is the percentage of people who leave within the first minute of showing up to a website. And like a standard pretty good bounce rate is something like 60 or 70% of people leave within the first minute. On Desmos, on our calculator, that number is 9%, which means that over 90% of people who show up actually end up playing around for more than a minute, which is like kind of bonkers. It's kind of off the charts. Like that's better than the New York Times. That's better than Facebook. The other fun metric there is that the average visit lasts for over 20 minutes. And so again, it's students just like pulling it up, feeling like they've got this cooperative environment and playing with it. And that number is better than Instagram. People spend longer contiguously on Desmos than they do on Instagram, which is kind of nuts to me. So I could go deeper into some of the crazy math that is possible in here. I think instead, I want to jump over and talk a little bit about what we do for accessibility for vision impaired and blind students. Does that sound okay?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So a lot of this work is guided. We actually have an engineer on our team whose mother is a math teacher, and the engineer and his brother, his twin brother, are both blind, blind from birth. And so he's an amazing programmer, and he's the one who's been leading this effort with the goal of making it so that Desmos works as well for him as it does for me, which is a daunting challenge. But as part of it, we've learned a huge amount that I think transfers over to other tech as well. And so the first set of things is what's called the WCAG accessibility standards. Has anyone heard of these standards? WCAG, it's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's really, really important with software, and you've probably noticed it often. And it's stuff like making sure that the contrast on buttons is sufficient that you can see it when it's up on a projector. And it's stuff like making sure one total cue for whether it works is if you can navigate by using like the tab key and go around the interface. This is a really fun game to play. Like go into your mail program or on Twitter or wherever you are and see what happens when you press tab. And if it lets you select elements, so you can do tab to get to it, and then you can do things like press enter to open it. And if it lets you do that, it means that it's probably accessible software. And this has some enormous repercussions. There's a lot of students, so if you're blind, of course, you can't click because you don't know where to click. But also if you have other physical impairments, clicking might be a real problem. And so being keyboard accessible is the way that you make software that can work for a really, really wide variety of students. We have students who use Desmos with eye tracking because they have a degenerative disease that makes it so that they can't use their hands, and they're still able to use everything about Desmos. So this is one of the big cues, and it's one of our big efforts, is to make it so that everything that you can do with a mouse, you can do with a keyboard as well. Playing around with software, you'll definitely notice that sometimes this isn't the case. The other question I had was whether this works with things like screen readers. And the answer to that is yes. So I'm going to show you that if I turn on the screen reader on my computer here. And so here I can type math,
2
and it
times 8. 2 times 8 equals 16.
And it can actually read out the math to me as I go. This was one of the first things Steve did, our blind engineer. And to give you a sense of how kind of groundbreaking this is, to have a talking calculator, which you need if you're going to use it when you're blind. The state of the art, if you're not using Desmos, costs $600. It's called the TI Orion. And instead, this is just built in for free for every single student on Desmos.
Eli, can you do the same thing? What happens if you type in a function?
Expression 2.
Let's try it.
Y equals I n left x. Y equals sign left parenthesis x right parenthesis says graph. To audio trace, press Option plus T.
Oh.
And so what this just told me is this is a graphable equation. And if you want to audio trace it, press Option plus T. Anyone want to guess what audio trace does?
It gives coordinates?
Oh, that's such a good guess. It's wrong.
Oh.
But there's no wrong answers. I'm sorry. So audio trace is, yeah, it actually can read off the coordinates. But the main feature of it is that us as sighted users can look at this and get a sense of the shape of the curve. And what Steve built is a way to play this graph as sound. And so it can turn this into actually kind of not very exciting, but music. And so let's see what that sounds like. I'm going to audio trace.
Audio trace on. Use arrow keys to navigate. To hear the graph, press H for a summary of points. Press Option plus S. To disable audio trace, press Option plus T. Expression 20, intercept at x, 0, y, 0.
And so actually this does, the main thing it does is it shows coordinates, and I can trace.
X, 0.116. Y, 0.116. X, 0.232. Y, 0.23.
So we can do that. I'm going to turn off my screen reader.
System preferences.
Yeah.
Keyboard, voiceover off.
And I'm going to do that thing where it plays it as music, and here's what it sounds like. And so what happens with this is now a blind student can hear this graph and can get a sense of it. And you can ask questions like, what happens if I change this to a 2? Or what if I put a 2 inside of here? And now we get a different sounding curve. It ends up actually being really useful even for sighted students, because there's some concepts that are actually really tricky, like the difference between this curve and this curve. And as soon as you play with audio trace, it ends up sounding really different from each other. versus this. And so we've seen more and more classrooms where this is just another representation that ends up being able to support different learning styles and to reinforce some of these concepts of what slope means and that kind of thing.
So how did you turn on either the audio tracing or the screen reader? What were the two things you did for that?
Such a good question. And instead of showing you that, I'm going to show you the set of resources that will make it so that you can teach anyone who asks you the same question how they can do it. So 2 resources that are helpful here. One of them is we have a page, desmos.com/accessibility. And this has an enormously long set of resources, especially for teachers of visually impaired students and for visually impaired students, with how to configure, how to set this up on any screen that you want, how to use keyboard shortcuts across the board, all of this. You could go to audio trace and it will show you how to do that. So here's where it's got the instructions. So this is one set of resources that I recommend. There's another set of resources that is a quicker introduction to some of these tools, which is probably where I'd suggest you go. And this one is called learn.desmos.com. This whole thing is built by one of the teachers on our team named Michael Fenton, who actually started this project before he worked at Desmos. He just built up this enormous set of support resources, and I'm like, oh my God, you need to work here. Can you please come work for Desmos? And he did, and it turned into learn.desmos.com. And the thing that I like about this is it's got a bunch of really comprehensive resources. So it's got resources on the graphing calculator, which we're showing. It also has resources about Desmos classroom activities. And it also has some helpful resources if you ever want to lead PD, or if anyone in your district wants to lead PD, for kind of self-led PD. It's got presenter notes, it's got slides that you're free to use or modify, it's got scavenger hunts, all of this stuff. But if you come in here and you click into graphing calculator, and then you go down to accessibility, which conveniently by alphabetization is right at the beginning. This has some really quick getting started, and then a couple-minute long video that also shows how to do all of this. Does that help?
It does, yes, thank you.
Brilliant, and that's actually perfect timing because my goal was to end with showing you learn.desmos.com. This is, I think, my favorite resource for learning more about Desmos and for sharing Desmos and for supporting teachers who want to use Desmos. One of the things we found is that students require, even the students who aren't mathematically confident, require basically no introduction. Like just set them on desmos.com and say mess around and they will, and they'll figure out stuff that even we didn't know. It's just so fun. And we find that it's often more helpful to provide these kinds of resources for the teachers in your departments who want to learn and get really deep on Desmos.
Great, so can I ask the first question? So part of what we were also talking, and by first I mean I've already asked like 5, but we also talked about, like people mentioned earlier, language and economics. So we kind of talked about economic because this is a free resource, but do you have multiple languages that students can navigate through Desmos with?
Yeah, we do, and a little bit more on the economic side as well. So one of the things that we've found is that even just having it be free isn't actually sufficient for making it so that it's available to everyone. And so one of the things that we've built is offline enabled apps for Android and for iPhone and iPad, and actually for Chromebooks, because some students don't have access to internet at home as well. And so those apps are totally free, totally recommend. We find that basically every student has access to a smartphone, even if some of them have real data restrictions. So it's both that they're there, and students should always feel free to download those. Those are free. And then we put in a lot of work to make it so that they work well if you don't have a good data connection. So on that front, in terms of languages, our graphing calculator is available in a variety of languages. We've tried to make it so it doesn't even really matter. Like the interface doesn't have words in it for the most part. There's a few. And so we find that even just using it in English, if it's not a native language, works pretty well. Math is really universal, which is nice. But there's some things where, you know, we have error messages, 2+, and you go over here and it says you need something on both sides of the plus symbol. And so we have, through volunteers, translated Desmos into a number of languages. And it's this globe up here in the corner. If you press that, you can see what Desmos looks like in Spanish. And so here, this is untitled graph, and this is save, and it says no changes. And here, not all of the messages are translated, but many of them are.
And Eli, are any of the teacher resources translated to Spanish, or are those, or any other language really, or are those all in English?
Some of them are. So like we have a user guide. This one is also in Spanish now. And so these are resources that can be shared as well for teachers. The stuff on teacher.desmos.com is not. That is today just in English. But we do, this user guide I think is a really, really nice resource in Spanish. The way to get to that is if you change the language to Spanish and then click on the user guide, then it opens it in Spanish.
Got it. Anybody else have questions before we pass it over to Kevin? Jackie said thank you in sign language. I don't know if you saw it.
Amazing.
No? All right, then thank you so much for sharing this. Kevin, can you tell us a little bit about the resource that you're going to share? And are you going to share it on your screen, or do you need me to pull something up?
Nope, I can share it on my screen. First of all, I just want to say, Eli, thank you. That's an amazing piece of software that you guys are still developing. One last question. Why Desmos? Where's the name come from?
Let me unmute. Why Desmos? Total crazy story, which is that we needed a name, we needed a website. My requirements for it was that I wanted it to be something that people could pronounce and that sounded like a little bit academic and that didn't have a ton of meaning. And one of my friends found this word Desmos, which is a Greek word, ancient Greek, that means link or connection. And I saw Desmos.com it wasn't available, but it was for sale. And so I offered the people who owned it 100% of my life savings at the time, which was $2,100. And they said, okay. And that's how we got Desmos.
Wow.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that piece. And I'm hoping, so last question now is, I'm hoping you've gotten your savings back and more.
Yeah. I'm actually paying myself salary now. It's wonderful. Yeah. Living the dream.
That's amazing. That's really good to hear. I mean, seriously, the fact that not only with the languages, but the software itself in terms of a graphing calculator, and that you've already thought through the multicultural issues and even the visually impaired. I mean, it's pretty impressive. So thank you from people who work with, you know, K-12 teachers and students. That's pretty amazing to think that level. So thanks again for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So I was just introduced by Heather and Janine earlier, and so Kevin McClure, and I'm out of Peoria, Illinois, and I work with the Illinois Classrooms in Action team. And Heather mentioned that I'm around learning supports. So teaching and learning supports is basically all those areas that don't exactly fit neatly into some of our core content areas, ELA, math, science, social science. So one of those areas is social emotional learning. And my background is in pretty varied, but I became very passionate about diversity and about how our educational systems are not very diverse, both racially or culturally, and our languages fracture us even more so as educational practitioners. And so when talking with the team, several of us decided to gather together and began talking about the phrase, the buzzword equity and access in education. And of course, with ESSA's requirements, we're really going to have more and more monitoring around this particular area and all the indicators that come with it. So Today, I'm very thankful to be invited by Heather and Janine and to share with you all two resources that I think are great. One's a great read, and certain pieces can be shared with teachers and or families of different cultural backgrounds. And the other one is a resource guide that was developed out of our Equity and Access work group that I'm just presented at Illinois State University's Cultural Conference this week, and I'm very excited about that. And if you have time, because we all just sit around, we don't have a lot of extra time, but if you have time to take a look at the resource guide or assign it to somebody to look at and have any feedback, Janine and Heather and I would be thrilled to get more feedback and more interest and comments from what you liked, what's missing, and where we're going from there. So let me just start with sharing these two links and in the chat box. One is called Minorities in Mathematics. And so let me share my screen for that one and we can take a quick look at that one. What this particular link shows us or is offering to us is a specific report that was written by Rocha Gutierrez and Sonia Irving, really talking about how Latino, Latina, now references Latinx, and Black students process mathematics. And so if you hadn't seen this report or hadn't viewed some of the things that they have in it, I think, again, as we as educators are looking at how do we help teach mathematics overall, but then how do we dig deeper into making that mathematics really usable by different cultural perspectives. This has some very specific things as practitioners and teachers of mathematics for us to consider. Their longer brief or the longer report, the full report, really goes into a lot of different recommendations. And some of the pieces coming out of this is some things that would be just part of our gut response to consideration. Everybody on this webinar who's seen Eli or talked about multiculturalism, or here in Illinois where equity and access are spoken of so frequently, we're really learning about how to make that embedded and integrated into education as a whole, and with the State Board of Education's mission statement of whole student, whole school, and whole community. Let me see, quick chat, somebody wrote something, okay. And so this is just a report. I'm not going to launch into it much more than that, but again, something just to research or just as a reference to help continue our professional growth in the way that we're approaching minorities in mathematics. That second link that I added in there is really going to take you to our resource guide. And we have this right now. The full name of it is the Educational Equity Through Framing Inclusive Conversations. This started as a resource guide specifically for multicultural conversations, and the more we talked about it and the more that we got feedback, it really needed to become a little bit broader than just multicultural. So really thinking about the differences that students and teachers and schools and districts and communities are experiencing, not just based upon culture, but around disabilities around or abilities, and thinking about the different phraseology that we all come with and the way we perceive and experience learning, and how that, especially as we move to more social learning constructs, Math Practice 3 around discourse and other ELA standards, how that socialization is going to require us as both educators and also as students to go beyond some of our bias and norms that may have held us back from some of that socialization. And again, our schools are being required to be the front runners in this. So looking through this, I hope that you will see some things that you might be able to utilize. One of the things that we wanted to make fairly user-friendly was really looking at how the different tools and resources out there for educators and or educational personnel, and the breadth and depth of those, how can we organize that so as a particular audience, I would be able to go quickly to a reference sheet and see these are tools or resources that have been vetted specifically for my particular role or responsibilities in the educational system. So we did an introduction and then really looked at grouping the resources by either administrators and also applicable to school boards, for classroom teachers, for classroom activities, and then even adding, because several tools really were much more about involving the social workers, the community, and family engagement personnel from schools. We also wanted to use some add some ready-to-use tools and materials. So we have some conversation templates that can help debrief some multicultural or inclusive conversations that may happen with or without particular guidance from an educator, as our students are less, less tentative about diving into some of those conversations themselves and with each other, whether it's positive or not. One of the first things that really, as I started vetting some of the resources, was quotes that I came by of Cory Booker, Senator Cory Booker, and this is actually an adaptation of Martin Luther King's Birmingham letters, and really talking about our charge as potential change agents or just reflectors of climate and culture. And then moving down into the introduction, really giving just a description of what is the purpose of this and looking at equity and access and inclusive conversations about 3 different phases of that. And so preparing for conversations, facilitating conversations, and or looking towards how do we build momentum or capacity for future conversations. And so as we look at that, the next thing that we wanted to include is kind of a one-page go-to of things that we're including and asking individuals who want to guide conversations or are involved in conversations to really continue to put forward. Almost as one reviewer noticed, that this is kind of a norm sheet for inclusive conversations. So really looking at why are we even interested in them, in inclusive conversations, then how would we prepare for those conversations? What are the things that maybe we used to do and we could practice differently?
Kevin, can I pause you one second?
Are you saying? Yes.
Can you zoom in just a little bit? Because I'm going to post the link again one more time for people to follow along. But especially I think you're going to talk a little bit about this part if people could read it. Perfect. Thank you.
Is that better? Thanks. So really looking at, again, kind of a one-page to go and support people as they're bringing groups together and facilitating conversations or preparing for those. So again, what can we do? What are the guiding pieces before conversations? And again, really being and helping us be more self-aware of the things that we perhaps used to do in facilitating conversations. And from many different resources, we've come up with a list of these are kind of a better positive practice of facilitating those conversations. And then again, some additional resources here that really help build capacity for educational personnel moving forward as a group or individually, depending upon how you might use this resource. The first population or audience that we really felt would have needed some and asked for some support in equity and access is administrators and school boards. So again, how do we take all that material out there that's on the web and how do we organize it so that it's usable for specific audiences? And so not only looking at this particular population audience, but also then again, tagging or organizing the resources by those 3 phases in the equity and access inclusive conversation. And so when you have time, and these are all hyperlinked, of course, because there are so many out there, and there were so many that we couldn't even include because of space and time. And with that, the last piece, and just to show you that we tried really hard to make this a very compact document as well. And so if there were certain resources that would be applicable to different audiences, what we tried to do is limit the repetition by simply listing it once and then tagging them with the other nomenclature of other audiences. So, for example, do conversations about race belong in the classroom from Melinda Anderson. It's included here for administrators and school boards for consideration, but we've also tagged it with a T for teachers and SW for social workers that they might also find that helpful. And again, that nomenclature and tagging is at the bottom here. So as you look about these different pieces and looking at teachers, and again, what we found was that there was a plethora of resources here, and really organizing them was one of our biggest tasks. There are actually less student-facing resources, which is interesting. Teaching Tolerance is a huge proponent of student use of materials, and so we've really tried to gather them in ways and even tag them per graded bands for uses by for students. And then lastly, again, here, counselors and social workers. As we look at the appendix, what we've done is given two examples of conversation frameworks. One is the Art of Focused Conversation, and that is actually a model that we encourage, and here's examples here that you can find, again, on these templates are on our website, both a blank one and also some examples of what participants might say. And this simple conversation is, hey, show this video about a privilege walk, and then take some time to facilitate the conversation of processing, and then what would students and or adults do with that group processing from that conversation. Another one is from Unbound Ed, and again, both of those templates are available on our website. One of the things that we've heard great feedback about, very positive feedback too, is this kind of condensed and compact glossary. So even as we as a group were talking about this and we're passionate about it, we're all going, well, what do you mean by multicultural? And what do you mean by equity? And when we say social justice, what does that mean to you? And so really putting it on paper here, pulled from various vetted sources, what we can move forward through shared meaning of language and specific definitions. Lastly here is just, again, we really wanted to make it usable. So vetting some videos and sorting them by grade band levels too, that might help spark and or help specific grade levels and teachers to have conversations. Again, we note here using some of the conversation frameworks to process that, and then ending with many of the resources or references, excuse me, that we included. All of this is part of the equity and access portion of our website that was just launched. Actually, earlier today was refreshed in its new format. I encourage you to take some time to look at it. And I know that I'm here by Heather and Janine and Dana, but I'll say that the math area is very dense and very helpful to a lot of individuals and schools around our state. So that is our Educational Equity Through Framing Inclusive Conversations resource guide. Again, I sure appreciate any feedback that you have reading it. And again, we love both positive, we like this, and critical thought partners. So again, thank you to everybody that's here, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Kevin. Does anybody have any questions directly for Kevin? Kevin, you want to stop sharing first so that everybody can see each other again? Thanks, Eli. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming. Great. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions right now for Kevin before we head out? I didn't mean to say it that way. You can have a minute or two to ask questions. So I will say that Janine and I have both been trying to work out, I know frequently in our newsletters, which are available on Classrooms in Action as well, they are also available through our listserv. We frequently, when we hear about people who are doing things regarding specifically math and equity and access. So unfortunately, Jackie had to leave early. She and Scott, now I can't remember his last name, I'll have to look up, have done great work creating high school statistics questions that are encouraging students to think about social justice, or encouraging students to think about how real numbers in the world show inequity or show disparity that we can work to overcome. And if you see, there's also other work that we've highlighted about trying to make sure that the questions that we're asking, even at a young grade, kind of starting with just inclusivity, is that the right word? Making sure we're including just even different names and different cultures in the types of questions we're asking, all the way starting at the elementary level. But then as we're moving throughout, talking more about having actual questions that kind of push that envelope. I know one of the books I'm currently reading, I'll share my screen for like a second here before we go, is this book, The Impact, those are my children, The Impact of Identity in K-8 Mathematics, Rethinking Equity-Based Practices from NCTM. NCTM has a few other books that kind of deal with social justice or equity and access or different layers of that. And so there are certainly some things that you can look at through them. I know we've talked about it on previous calls, but the other thing that I find interesting is TNTP's The Opportunity Myth. These are two resources I can put in the forum as well. And I had the page here that I wanted to show. But in choosing the opportunity gap part of the opportunity myth, it talks both about expectations for students that are gifted, but it also talks about how different students are seeing so many different things, and how that even students that maybe either low income or in those what we've traditionally called at risk or resilient students, how they can still take challenging material, and how we continually are giving students that probably need the challenge the most, we're tending to give the easiest material to. And therefore, we're just exasperating those situations. So I think it's really important. I think this is also some good things to look at. So those are a couple of my things before we go. Does anybody else have any other questions or comments? I'll make sure to put those in the forum before we go. That they want, does anybody have any other questions or comments before we go? All right, then I am going to share one last time, if I can find it. Now I have too many links open. Please take a minute right now if you have the chance, or later on if you need to think about it, some topics or some questions that we want you to answer about the post survey, from our post survey, to tell us how you're going to use this information moving forward. We desperately want to know what you want to talk about next time. Our next session, we aren't going to have one because of Thanksgiving at the end of this month. We'll be in December, but please tell us what topics and any people or anything that you'd like us to keep in mind for next time. And then lastly, I'm going to say, here's my I voted sticker. So as we're talking about equity and access, I love that everybody that's laughing, because they know. As we're talking about equity and access, the biggest way to do that is to make sure everybody's voice is heard. So vote for whoever you want, but vote. Thanks, guys. Have a good night.